Hello, Doms and Submissives. I am Master Zahn of Ontario, Canada, and this is going to be the second lecture in the series that I am posting. Today's lecture is on consent. Now, I've covered this topic quite a while ago, back when I first started doing lectures and helping people. I covered it in crash courses until enough people began asking questions that I felt a lecture was needed. So I didn't get around to doing this lecture until the 10th one. So again, though, this lecture was done in March, so it is a little bit behind. I have added a bit to it this time beforehand, so just bear with me if I read and skim over a couple of small parts. Now, the basics of consent are simple. Both parties agree to something, like a Dom wanting to tie up their submissive with rope. The Dom suggests it, the submissive consents to it, or as the case may be, doesn't, but we're going with consent. As the sub consents to being tied up, the Dom acts on it. That's simple, basic consent. Every Dom and submissive should be able to understand that much of it. But there are things beyond basic consent. Like, let's say your sub has consented to being punished when they act up. I live a 24/7 dynamic with my slave wife, but most people don't. And it's in your contract that you're actually able to punish at any time for anything. The sub is upset, calling the Dom names, getting agitated, whatever. Even though the sub is consented, unless directly specified in the dynamic rules and protocols that it's okay to punish at that time, it should be considered that consent is revoked. Consent can be revoked at any time, so it's better to play it safe when it comes to it. Now, it's at this point that true DOMs and true subs are the ones that can make things beyond basic consent work. Like, if a Dom is upset, they should know when a punishment is deserved and earned, but they should also know when they're too upset to administer a punishment. Keeping the sub's safety in mind, a Dom should never punish when they are unable to control what they're going to do at all times. But a sub also should know when they deserve a punishment and offer themselves for that punishment. In other words, submit for it, and shouldn't always leave it up to the Dom to be the one to say, "You've earned it, let's go." Now, unless previously put about in a contract or at least talked about in great length and detail, anytime someone is upset, it should be considered as though consent is revoked until everything is calmed down, in which case you then pick up your dynamic and punish as needed. False consent is a hard topic, but it's very easy to spot if you know the signs. False consent, as I mentioned in the first lecture, BDSM versus abuse, is when a submissive fears saying no. It can also be when a Dom fears to say no to the submissive for fear of them using the dynamic against them, using the revoking of consent against them. I'll touch on that again in just a little bit. Also, if the sub is in extreme pain or pleasure at any time, it might not be fair to try asking for consent for anything then, because as studies with torture show, someone under torture will say or do anything to make it stop. So if you're giving a submissive a way out, they will probably take it, even if it's not something that they would do. However, I would like to point out that negotiations for a break during an intense scene can be justified if for no other reason than there's no other time to do it. If you're having a 2-hour scene and the sub is exhausted and needs a break, it's hard to say when you would negotiate for a break beforehand, before starting. So the only time to do it is at that time. Now, the true power in a dominant-submissive relationship is actually held by the submissive with their submission and their consent to the things that the Doms do. I've heard it put before that without our subs, Doms are just strange people threatening to spank their cats. But consent can also extend to the sharing of photos, videos, even details about individual dynamics. Submissives can abuse the power of consent by using it as a weapon when upset or evoking it when or every time a Dom says that a punishment is earned. Doms must also give consent to their subs for their subs to be able to share details of the dynamic, their training, or training methods of their Dom as well. Everyone must consent to any act or activity or information pertaining to the dynamic or activities at all times. That's how we keep everything safe, sane, and consensual. Now, I already have students for my classes, but they're not able to share the way that I teach my classes, simply because then other places could use them. So my consent, or the consent of the teacher teaching a class at a time, would need to be given for these students to be able to share how they've been taught and what methods are being taught in the school. It's the same thing with the activities when me and my slave wife start a house. The activities and events in the house are actually protected by confidentiality, and any one part of the house would need consent to share that information. Now, there's also such a thing called non-consensual consent. After my original lectures on consent, this came up quite a number of times, and so I've decided to add in a section about it into my lecture now. NCC, non-consensual consent, can apply to a number of things, but I'm going to use drug play as a main example here. Let's say you have a submissive who takes heavy sleepers, and the sleepers make them kind of loopy. It doesn't completely knock them out, but they're not in any kind of state to be able to consent to any activities or any dynamic related activities at the time that they've taken them. The submissive, if they trust their Dom, is able to consent beforehand to being played with at that time. Even though they can't revoke their consent, it's called non-consensual consent. But in the wrong hands, this kind of consent can be very dangerous. It can lead to people being hurt feelings, uh, accidental abuse, or even intentional abuse from within the dynamic. In the wrong hands, it's not something that you want to be giving out. That's why it's something for true subs and true doms. The submissive needs to fully trust their dominant that they would not go past the limits that have been set, even when the submissive most likely won't remember most of it. Now, some people stop their activities at the level of basic consent, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But everyone in every dynamic is unique. Some people tend to enjoy the darker sides of certain things. Me and my slave wife pop into mind right away. But no matter what the dynamic or activity, consent of every aspect of a scene should be established beforehand. Now, I want to point out that it's not a weak person that submits to a Dom. It takes a very strong-willed person to submit all of themselves to a will of another person. Whether it's a male or female submissive, it takes an enormous amount of willpower to put aside what you want and do what the dominant wants. It can also be an act of empowerment. Now, most people are familiar with feminine empowerment, but there is such a thing as masculine empowerment as well. Either one can come from either side, but for this lecture, I'm going with the submissive side. Submission itself can be an act of feminine or masculine empowerment. Feminine empowerment is basically doing what you want to do despite what the view of society tells you is expected of you. It's just like the masculine role. In most societal views, the man should be the dominant. Well, for a man to be submissive can be an act of empowerment for them. It is just them doing what they want. It's not degrading. It's not subjugation of the individual, be it male or female. It's an act of empowerment and freedom to be able to do what you want to do. That pretty much covers the lecture on consent along with little bits of extra. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them below. I'll try to answer them as soon as I can. I am a family man, as well as having the lecture chat, many pages, and starting a school. So if it takes me a bit, I apologize. But this is Master Zahn for Master Zahn's Dominant Submissive King School, I suppose, signing off. Thank you everyone for your time.